All right, so does anybody have any questions regarding the essay at this point? Things that I can address between now and the due date on Friday.
What percentage is this?
It's 200 points or 20% of your grade. So, right, all your points in the grade add up to 1,000. That's a combination of things like the midterm, your weekly attendance and participation, and so on. I know a lot of folks weren't able to make it on Friday because they had athletics or other things going on. As a reminder, you can always make up assignments for days that you missed. So complete that make-up assignment on Canvas within 2 weeks of the day that you missed, and that will add that credit back in for you. Yes?
So if we're writing about a TV episode, can we reference other episodes in the show, or do we have to stick with the one episode?
You should stick with the one episode for your analysis. You can reference other episodes for context. So in order to understand this character and their relationship with this other character, we need to know X, Y, Z. And if you can contain that to a couple sentences, like in your introductory paragraph, that'll allow you to set up the rest of the essay. Okay. Yeah? Yes?
Do we have final?
There's no cumulative final exam in the course. Instead, there's a final recording and reflection essay that you'll be turning in at the end of the quarter. In that last essay, what I'm asking you to do is to record a conversation between you and somebody else, transcribe that conversation, and then use some of the material we've talked about toward the end of the quarter as a way to understand and make sense of that conversation. So, no big cumulative exam, but there is a final essay that'll ask you to reflect on the things that we've done in the class overall. So, the terms and things we've gone over in the class will be helpful for you in preparing for that final assignment. Any question? In terms of what I'm looking for, and in terms of things that I think make for really good essays, I noticed a little bit in my afternoon class, some people who turned in rough drafts for feedback. So a couple things to keep in mind. Remember, this is 4 pages double spaced in addition to a works cited page. 4 pages means 4 full pages. It does not mean 3 pages and like a line or 2 in the 4th page, right? If you're finding that you're not able to meet that minimum page requirement, an easy way to help with that is to really make sure that you're focused on getting that transcribed dialogue and conversation. I find a lot of people who struggle on the page limit just need to dig deeper into the content of the essay in order to find more things to analyze and look at. Another thing is that I've noticed the incorporation of source citations could be a little bit off. So one thing that I noticed in some of the rough drafts that I've seen is that it'll be like sentence, and then it'll just include a quote from Jant. My advice is to introduce and set up quotations when you include them, right? So rather than including a sentence and then all of a sudden, interpersonal communication is XYZ in the next sentence from Jant, right? You might say, in order to engage in this relationship, we need to understand interpersonal communication. As Jant argues, comma, quotation. So introduce your sources. If I'm reading and there's suddenly a quotation and I don't understand why the quotation was introduced or how it fits into the essay as a whole, it makes it a lot choppier and harder to follow. So I definitely recommend using those transition clauses in order to introduce and explain the quotations that you've included. Don't include large block quotations if you're not using the entirety of that quotation for your essay. I find that sometimes people will post large blocks of text, but there's not a whole lot within that text that you're actually using. So maybe there's a particular line of dialogue that's important. You can use larger quotations and block quotes if the entirety of that passage is relevant to you, but I definitely discourage you from having that larger set if it's not being incorporated. Also, your introduction does not need to be a broad survey of interpersonal communication as a whole, right? It does not need to say interpersonal communication is this dynamic and life-changing process. Instead, focus on the key terms and ideas that you're bringing into the essay. So rather than starting your introduction with, this is interpersonal communication, you might start with, verbal communication is a major part of how we choose to engage with others, and it involves X, Y, Z. That way, you're able to start your essay a lot more focused, and that'll also help that initial writer's block of not being sure what your introductory paragraph looks like. Another pet peeve of mine are paragraphs that are too long. So my advice is try to cap your paragraph length at about half a page, double spaced. Reason for that is if you have paragraphs that are like a page long, if not longer, then typically you have a lot of ideas that could be broken up into a second paragraph. So that'll help the overall flow and structure of your essay work better. As a reminder, I have a rubric that I use directly to grade this assignment. An easy way to see if you're doing well is to look directly at that rubric and say, okay, yes, I'm doing this, yes, I'm doing this, yes, I'm doing this. Also remember that there's an example outline that you can use for this essay too, that gives you a sense of the exact formatting and style that you might be able to incorporate well. I'd rather have a late paper than a plagiarized paper. Remember that if your paper does not include full works cited and in-text citations, it's at best a 0 on the paper, at worst a 0 in the class. So it's more strategic for you to turn something in late and make sure it has citations than to not. So again, plagiarism does not need to be intentional. So make sure to be citing those outside sources. Any other questions? Yes?
Do we need a formal title page?
You do not need a formal title page, no. You can include one if you want to, but that would not count toward your overall pages on the assignment. So, yeah.
Can I spoil?
Yeah, sure. What are you,
Like, I want to like about detail the relationship.
oh, yeah, yeah.
Like, I need like about background or something.
Sure. So I'll take the hit, I'll read the spoiler. So feel free to share, like, if it is important details about the show or movie that you feel like somebody needs to know in order to understand the essay. Yes?
Like it's all about loss and nature relationships. So I think everyone
Sure.
already knows
Sure.
about it.
Yeah. But yes, you can definitely include those details if they're relevant and support your overall project. As a reminder, I will continue to look at rough drafts and outlines up until Wednesday. When I look at your rough draft or outline, I get a sense of overall what your grade would be on this assignment, what you should expect to receive. I like to give some detailed inline comments to help you. So I definitely recommend, if you want to do well on this assignment, to turn in that rough draft or outline so that you can know what you need to fix going into the final draft. So I announced last Friday, and I want to make sure everybody knows, including people who weren't here last week, that this Friday's class doesn't have any new reading, and I've decided to make attendance optional for Friday. Basically, the way Friday will work is that this is a space where you can work on your essay. I'll be here. I will also be here to answer questions or help you out as you're wrapping up the essay. But because it's due on midnight at that day, in my experience, most of the time, a lot of people will choose to take the time to not show up to class and work on the essay anyway. So if it's easier for you to spend the time not coming to class, finishing up your essay, you're welcome to do that. But if you would like to come to class on Friday, I will be available to help you out with answering questions and so on. As a reminder as well, there is an extra credit opportunity that's available on Canvas and due December 10th. I talked a little bit about that one last week, but that's available for you to work on too, especially if you're feeling pretty good about your essay and overall position in the class. So last week, we looked at the role of mediated communication. We looked at a lot of different parts here. So for instance, some key terms and questions. We looked at some guiding theories in mediated communication. So for instance, social information processing theory that puts out the idea of hyper-personal communication, that we can be really involved through the use of media, as well as things such as media richness theory that looks at how engaged we are. So this stuff is really helpful for you if for your essay you're interested in the role of media in communication, or you're looking to incorporate this into your final project in the class. So for instance, if a TV show episode or movie incorporates what we've seen a lot more recently, where they have the text bubbles that show up like on the screen to indicate a conversation, you could look at those mediated elements to understand how that impacts the relationship. So for this class, we are shifting gears and we're moving on to the role of relationships. Again, this will be directly helpful for you if you want to incorporate any of these ideas into your essay for this week or into your final essay for the course, because since I'm asking you to look at a relationship with a close friend or family member in your final project, it'll be something that's super relevant there. So I want to give some examples and applications that help us to understand relationships in everyday life. Today is going to be a little bit more lecture heavy, and then Wednesday we're going to do kind of more examples and group level activities to understand these ideas even more. So again, the essay is coming up. Remember, 4 pages plus works cited list, 2 to 3 body points. Remember to quote, include your citation, whether it's a direct quote or a paraphrase. If it's an idea that comes from somebody that's not you or not common knowledge, it should be a cite. And turn in those rough drafts or outlines by Wednesday. So, as we're thinking about the new stuff for today, one of the key kind of guiding questions here is kind of why do relationships matter? And more specifically, why is it important for us to understand relationships for a class like this one? So you might be taking other courses in things like sociology, anthropology, and a lot of different areas like some of the hard sciences, business, and so on, right? And in a lot of these classes, you are going to some extent, look at the role of relationships and the ways that relationships impact our lives. I think for this class, because our class is focused on interpersonal communication, right? The meaningful communication between two people, understanding relationships and the role that relationships have in communication is incredibly important. That is, communication is essentially the vehicle by which relationships can develop and change over time. So if we think back to the very beginning of class and on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, there's a lot of different needs that we can fulfill through relationships, whether they're essential survival needs, getting things like food, shelter, water, and so on, right? Asking for directions, getting somebody to help you if your car is broken down, all the way up to things such as self-actualization, finding meaningful people to connect with and relate to as your relationship develops over time. So when we understand the importance of relationships, we understand interpersonal communication as a way that those things develop through things such as self-disclosure, going back to uncertainty reduction theory and social penetration theory, right? The idea that as we have a closer relationship with other people, we become more comfortable, we choose to share more and more details about them. These are all really important ideas, and I think ways that we can apply interpersonal communication into understanding our relationships. So from a communication perspective, we need to understand how our messages are impacting the relationship, helping the relationship develop and change, and so on. So one of the ways to break down relationships is in terms of its characteristics. So when you think about a relationship with somebody else, you can in many ways define your relationship with somebody like a close friend on the basis of these different attributes, right? The first is duration. So if you have like a really good childhood friend, somebody that you've been in touch with for many, many years and years, that's an example of a long duration. You could find that you're very different people, but you still regularly keep in touch with your friend. Maybe you wouldn't be friends now if you tried to initiate a relationship, but because there's a lot of history there, the duration and length of time of a relationship is really important, right? Relationships are more likely to last, at least to some extent, if there are some similar and shared interests. We also use things like social media to maintain relationships over time as things like moving, jobs, and so on change. The contact frequency is another really important element of relationships. It's not just the amount of time that you're with somebody else, but it's a question of how regularly you're in contact with somebody else, right? So, for instance, my sister and I make it a habit of talking on the phone with each other every week. We maintain that level of contact because it's comfortable for us, and it helps us feel like our relationship can be managed in a good way. So, we all probably have friends, if we use social media, who are people that we have not talked to in years, that are like from back in high school, or something like that, right? There's a lot of relationships where we don't have that level of contact frequency. We wouldn't necessarily consider somebody a friend, or we have certain situations in which we check up on somebody. So how much you contact and keep up with that other person is really important. Sharing is another really key idea. It's the degree of self-disclosure that you bring to that relationship with that other person. So, for instance, there's a lot of people that might have a lot of friends. They might have like thousands of friends on social media, but they don't really know other people that well. They kind of have more surface level relationships because there hasn't been a lot of sharing or self-disclosure or details communicated between the two. So based on things like social penetration theory and uncertainty reduction theory, we see that more personal details, your goals, your aspirations, your social and political views, those types of things help to develop over time as you feel more comfortable with somebody else. So one of the key questions that you might ask here as you're thinking about sharing in your relationships is, how much do I know about this other person? And based on how much you're able to figure out in terms of a lot of their ideas and views, that tells you a lot about the relationship closeness. Support, right? How much can you count on the other person? Is this somebody that's really reliable, that you're able to reach out to if there's something that's a problem? Or is it somebody that you're very independent with? So that can be a really important variable too. How much do we count on or see this other person as a way to fulfill our needs and let them into our inner circle? Interaction variability is an interesting one because basically interaction variability means that the relationship with that person can play out in a lot of different ways depending on the situation or the time that you're with somebody else, right? So, for instance, my partner and I are able to have a lot of interaction variability because we are at times like both very serious and focused. We got our headphones on, we're at our computer, but we also might go out to a concert, right? And do something fun, chaotic, or silly. So interaction variability suggests that we're able to have a lot of different types of situations with that other person. So you might think about or list out the times that you've spent with a friend and see how much different stuff you're able to do with them. If all you do with a friend, like you were like me during high school at lunch and you played Smash Bros during school lunchtime, right? A lot of my friends that I had were just from playing that game. And I didn't have a whole lot of interaction variability. We just did that. We were pretty different people outside of that. So interaction variability is a key idea here. And then goals. So one thing here that's important are the expectations you have on where the relationship is headed or it's going. So maybe you meet somebody and go on a first date and you get really excited. You've got a lot of goals for you and that other person. Maybe you're going to become really close, have a good relationship with that person and start dating, and so on. So oftentimes we feel challenges if our goals are mismatched or we don't feel like we have the same ideas of where the relationship should go. So those are a lot of the ways that we can define relationships overall, and of course can impact the communication that chooses to happen within those relationships. Another key idea here is attraction, right? And attraction gets to these kind of core stages of how relationships can be developed and shaped over time. So attraction is important because it helps us be the initiating step in engagement with somebody else. So good friend of mine that I knew from high school reached out to me because it turned out we were both really into martial arts, right? I did Kushu Kempo for about 3 years, and I really enjoyed getting to know and finding somebody with shared interests. So there's a lot of ways that you have that initial step where you find things in common with somebody else. One of the key ideas here, right, is physical attraction, right? That's something, especially in the context of romantic relationships, that we'll oftentimes see, right? We swipe right if there's somebody we think looks attractive to us, but that can also be true of friendships too, that we're more drawn to friends if we consider the friend to be physically attractive, because even if we're not personally attracted to that person, we might find that we see that as them being, popular or interesting or fun to be around. There's a more general positive association that we might have with the person just based on their physical appearance. Social attraction is another key idea, right? Is somebody fun to be around? So for instance, if you were or knew the class clown, right, who was very silly, crack jokes all the time in class, right? That's somebody that we might feel social attraction to because we say, hey, they're a lot of fun. They're really interesting. And then the last thing here is the idea of task attraction. So, right, in an example, like say you have a hiking group and you have other people that are also into that, you might find people that you're friends with and that you're attracted to because you have similar interests with that other person. Maybe you've made a friend because you're in the same dorm room. Or maybe you have a friend because you're taking the same class. Or maybe you have a friend because you've done something such as a meetup group and you've found a set of people that have similar activities to you that you enjoy doing. So we're oftentimes drawn to people based on some of the things that they're interested in, specialize in, or the things that they like to do that are similar to you. So those forms of attraction are an important way that we can create these initiating steps in our relationships. So there's a lot of things that can influence the reason that we choose to be attracted to other people, right? One of the key ideas here that we hear a lot of times described is whether or not opposites attract, including in the context of romantic relationships. So we'll think about this for just a minute. But there's a few factors at play here, right? We're attracted to people on the basis of proximity. So there's actually been research in psychology that suggests that we tend to like people overall the more that we're around them. So maybe you have some coworkers, or maybe you have some other students that you talk to, right? You feel more positively about them over time because they're more familiar, you feel more comfortable, you have a better sense of what to expect from them. In fact, a lot of people find that maybe in the early months of a new job, they don't have a whole lot of connection, but that they gradually start to share a little bit more with their coworkers and they start to feel more comfortable. Physicality is another key role, especially with the number of jobs that have switched to remote or having a remote component in the context of COVID-19. Our physical presence with somebody else can definitely play a really good role. For instance, I've been in touch with other faculty in communication, but a lot of other communication faculty are currently remote. So the only ways that I've had to interact with them have been through Zoom. And I feel like our relationships have not developed quite as much because we don't have physical presence with one another. We're not in the same office building, we don't regularly see each other, and so on. Perceived gain, right, is the idea that we can benefit from the relationship. So this can seem a little bit like selfish, but that doesn't necessarily just mean that you're getting money or that you're using the other person. It's the idea that you see a relationship as helping you with overall feelings, maybe of loneliness, of isolation, of wanting connection and support. So there's ways that you see the relationship as helping you in some capacity. I've seen a lot of TV shows and movies, right, where there's the popular character that likes to befriend the not very popular character and like give them a makeover or help them become more popular, right? And a lot of times in those types of shows, the unpopular person will seek out the opinion and guidance of the popular person to get that benefit. So similarities and differences is a really important thing. So again, we hear a lot of times, as depicted in media, the idea that opposites attract, and there's a lot of complicated parts of that. We're oftentimes drawn to people because they have a lot of interesting similarities to us. We see a lot of ways that we're able to connect and have a good conversation with somebody else because of shared interests. But we might also find somebody that's really different than us to be really interesting. For instance, maybe you find a student in another class who talked about how they successfully climbed Mount Everest. And you think, wow, that's amazing. That's an incredible person. I want to get to know that person. So oftentimes, we're drawn to differences if they create a sense of novelty or intrigue that lets us want to get to know them better. And then disclosure is another element of attraction, right? The degree to which we feel or are able to share who we are with somebody else is probably a reason that we're more likely to be attracted to them. So for instance, if you find something like a community or group that has some shared interests as you do, right, then you might choose to share more of yourself, and therefore feel more drawn to that other person. So do opposites attract? How many folks, and there's no right or wrong, I'm not asking you like a formal way, right? But how many folks think that in the context of like a romantic relationship, it's more likely the opposites would attract and have a good relationship with each other? How many folks feel like opposites don't really attract? Okay, most of you. Yeah, so opposites don't really attract, but there's some exceptions, right? So there's been a lot of research in communication, psychology, and sociology that has looked at this narrative that people who have very different tastes and interests and so on would develop a closer relationship with each other than people that are similar. What studies have found is that oftentimes in these initial steps of forming a relationship, the people who find similarities in terms of social views, cultural views, and so on are more drawn, right? Birds of a feather. And it's oftentimes easier to initiate and maintain relationships if people find those initial similarities. However, right, you have somebody like somebody who climbed Mount Everest that can create an initial level of excitement or intrigue that draws somebody. But what ends up happening over time in a lot of relationships is that because people are so different, they can find it very, very difficult to find ways to effectively communicate with each other about issues, right? So if somebody is very talk-oriented when it comes to conflict, and another is very avoidance-oriented, then that difference can make it way harder for both people to be understood and for the relationship to work. A key idea here that also helps us to understand why we choose to be in relationships is exchange theory. So exchange theory kind of looks at relationships in terms of math, right? It says we choose relationships because we look at the perceived gains of the relationship with the other person versus the costs that the relationship might have. So this has been kind of critiqued in some situations because not everybody thinks about relationships in a mathematical way like that, right? But it deals with the tolerance that we have for certain challenges or problems in the relationship versus the challenges that somebody might have in terms of other relationships if they chose to end this one. So say somebody is dating somebody else and getting to know them, and they find that there's a few red flags or a few differences that they have with the other person. Maybe they have to be gone for weeks at a time because of work, and they're worried about maintaining the relationship given that level of distance. They might say, you know what, I really like this person, and despite this issue, I want to work with that person because I think this person has a lot to offer and bring to the table that I don't see in my other relationships. So that could be an example of using exchange theory, of thinking about, okay, overall, this relationship is worth it, and I'm going to choose this relationship over other options. So we don't necessarily always think about this totally, is the relationship worth it, keep it or not? We'll oftentimes maintain relationships that are negative, that are toxic, that are harmful on a lot of bases. Some of them might be out of survival or necessity. Other times it might be because we see the relationship as having the potential to get better. But in a lot of situations, we are making some level of calculation about how and why we're continuing to maintain relationships, especially if we're choosing whether or not to resume or initiate contact with somebody else. If you don't feel like it's a very good friendship, you're probably not going to choose to go out to coffee with that person. So this gets at, right, the similarity thesis, the birds of a feather perspective, right? Famous saying, birds of a feather flock together. We are drawn to people that are similar to us in terms of a lot of attributes like our identities, interests, things like political and social views, of course, have become a really big element of this as well. And some of the ideas here in this thesis include validation. Can somebody understand your point of view and affirm your perspective? So, for instance, for many members of the LGBTQ+ community who have encountered challenges and things like homophobia, right? People can say, oh yeah, had that happen to me too, right? So there's a lot of situations like that where somebody's able to affirm and have a similar sense of experience. Predictability deals with the idea that we feel safe around somebody else. So oftentimes, relationships with people similar to us are more predictable, right? If we find somebody that's in the same job, working at the same office as we do, we tend to find that over time, we know their routine, we feel more comfortable on that basis as well. And then affiliation. So affiliation gets at some of the elements of collective self-esteem and culture right? Do we feel a sense of shared identity with that person or shared experience with that person, right? So if you're on a sports team and your team has won a game, right? There's this amazing feeling that you get where you feel like you're a part of this group, right? Where everybody put in their all and did a great job and you feel connection with other people. That affiliation is a big reason that we can feel similarity and comfort with other people in our relationships. So one of the key ideas here that I think is useful for us to understand and contextualize the relationships that we choose to do are these 10 different stages of relationships. So this model, right, suggests that there's 5 stages coming together and then 5 stages is coming apart. I'm going to talk through these stages in a little bit more detail. But a couple things that I think are good to know about these 10 stages. Half of them deal with how a relationship comes together or builds up. And the other half are how the relationships come apart or break down, right? Not every relationship is going to go through all 10 of these stages. In fact, the vast majority of our relationships tend to stop around here because we find that we're not able to fully connect to somebody else, or for whatever reason, the relationship just doesn't continue. Also, there might be a lot of relationships, like, those couples that are really happily married after 50 years and really cute together, right, where the relationship has remained at this bonding stage. The last thing that I think is good to know, too, is that not every relationship is linear. That is, it doesn't just go one direction through these different stages. For instance, a relationship might go really well. It might have some differentiation and circumscribing. A relationship might break down, but people might rekindle the relationship through doing things such as, counseling or support, or renewing their vows or something like that could bring it back into the realm of bonding. So it can move back the other direction. So I get a bunch of listicles recommended on my social media all the time, which I know are weird and predatory and scammy, but one that I thought was kind of silly were some of the top celebrity bromances. So Chris Hemsworth and Chris Evans, both from Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thor and Captain America, right, are really good friends in real life. And one thing that's been really interesting is in the past several years, right, the idea of a bromance has developed where there's men that are publicly really good friends that have formed really good relationships with each other in a platonic way. And there's been, a lot of emphasis on normalizing good, close relationships between men that oftentimes has not been talked about or understood as well. In fact, a lot of men report having particular challenges with being able to maintain and have good friendships with other people. So it's been interesting to look at some of the ways that these have developed. This type of model is helpful because not every stage of coming together or breaking apart is necessarily in romantic relationships. It can be really good friends, right? And creating something like a bromance. This relates to the idea of initiating, having a very brief initial contact with somebody else, right? So if you're going on a date, that could be meeting the person, saying hello, finding out their social media profile, doing a phone call beforehand. It's making that initial contact with the other person. And generally speaking, right, you don't learn a whole lot about the other person. After that, we like to experiment. We like to get a little bit more details about the person. Maybe you've gone on a first date and you want to go on a second date at a park. That might be an example of using a different context to get to know that person a little bit better and feeling more comfortable. You feel like you like the person or have that initial feeling of attraction, and you say, you know what, I want to see where this goes. Intensifying is when you generally share a lot more personal details with somebody else. It typically involves figuring out and sharing the core of who you are, your struggles, your challenges, and so on, right? So don't judge, but in the evenings sometimes I like to catch up and be silly and watch episodes of The Bachelor and Bachelorette. I know they're very silly and trashy, but it's kind of fun. So on a lot of these shows, there's these like one-on-one dates, right, where the person is going on a date with somebody else, and the other person chooses to disclose and share personal details as a way of building the relationship. In a recent episode of The Bachelorette, there was a character, or a person, character, reality TV, so they're basically characters, who was sharing their challenges, feeling like they were the reason that their parents divorced. So that level of intensity and challenge was creating personal details that were able to build that relationship further. Integrating, right? Integrating was something that, at least when I was younger, tended to be called being FABO or being Facebook official. I know Facebook is a lot less popular and used, right? But there might be situations where that's still incorporated. So leading to that formal relationship or saying, oh, this is my boyfriend, might be an example of that direct putting a label on something. In fact, a lot of relationships will end kind of between this intensifying to integrating stage because people might have fear related to commitment, or we might hear the classic phrase, I don't want to put a label on it. So people might feel like integration is not something that they're equally comfortable with. And then bonding is this very publicly reveal of a relationship. It could be something like a civil union, it could be something like a marriage, right? Could be something like in 4 Weddings and a Funeral, where they like proudly say at the end, oh, I am so happy to never get married with you, right? But it's this example of this public relationship and commitment that you demonstrate to another person. Right? So again, these initial steps are about building that relationship and trust with other people. Whereas the back half is focused on how relationships come apart and the ways that those relationships break up. So I want to show an example a little bit here of a movie you might have seen, 500 Days of Summer, which is an example of kind of jumping through a lot of these different relationship stages. Coming apart relates to differentiating or viewing yourself as different from other people, saying, you know what, my partner and I disagree, or maybe it's creating your own thing. Circumscribing is limiting time. Maybe the other person is going out a lot more, they're spending more time with their friends than in the relationship, and they just choose not to engage. Stagnating is this overall feeling. It's like you're sitting on the couch with somebody else and it just doesn't seem like you're able to talk about much or feel like the relationship is moving in the direction that you hope it does. Avoiding would involve directly trying to get away from the relationship and say, you know what, I don't like this. Sometimes people might sleep separately at that point, being on the couch. And then terminating is this sort of formal end to the relationship. Could be something official like a breakup. So these stages help us to understand how relationships can develop and also how relationships can end. I'm curious, how many people have seen 500 Days of Summer? A couple people? So the premise of the film, right, is that the main character, it kind of jumps between the different stages of the relationship with this other person. It's trying to understand and kind of make out the ways that the relationship developed and broke apart. And so by the film kind of jumping around and showing us these different stages of relationship, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to parse out about how these relational steps are put into practice.
I love the Smiths.
Sorry?
I said I love the Smiths. You've criticized me as I
So initiating.
die by your side, such a heavenly way to die. I love them.
This is a story of boy meets girl.
They made a statue about
The boy, Tom Hansen, grew up believing that he'd never truly be happy until the day he met the one. The girl, Summer Finn, did not share this belief. You should know up front, this is not a love story.
I think we should stop seeing each other.
Just like that?
Just like that.
Start from the beginning and tell us what happened.
I tried to talk to her in the copy room. She's totally not happy. Maybe she was just in a hurry. And maybe she's an uppity, better than everyone super skank. In college, they called me perfectly adequate Hanson.
He used to call me anal girl. I was very neat and organized.
So So you have a boyfriend?
No. Who needs it? We're young, might as well have fun while we can.
Wait. What happens if you fall in love?
You don't believe that, do you?
What? It's love, it's not Santa Claus.
Like intensifying.
I think it's official. I'm in love with Summer. I love how she makes me feel. Did you ever even have a boyfriend?
Of course.
What happened? Why didn't they work out?
What always happens? Life.
But get over her. I don't want to get over her. I want to get her back.
Differentiating, trying to move on from differentiating. So again, because the relationship in this film is not just depicted in a linear way, right? It moves back and forth, the relationship develops, it intensifies, and it starts to break over the course of the film, right? We see these different relationship stages that play, and I think it's an example of helping to apply and understand some of these stages in action. So we'll talk a little bit more about this next class, but we do have a lot of these different stages of maintenance, right? We do things like staying positive, like sharing our information, like dealing with conflict and so on when it comes up as a way to keep our relationships going well. So we'll look more into this for next class and more into some of the specific relationship strategies that we might choose to use in order to create a good relationship overall. So what I'd like you to do in the last few minutes of class is write or type with your name and think about these different stages of relationships in the context of somebody else. So it could be a friend, it could be somebody that you're very close to. Given the 10 stages of relationships, so I'd like you to write down just what you feel like your relationship stage is with this other person. Some of the major things that you might think you and that other person can gain from the relationship, and how you try to maintain that relationship with somebody else. This could be a close friend, family member, partner, and so on. Yes?
The number, the 7 is higher or 1 is higher?
So 7 would be higher. It would be like the stage of coming apart. So 1 would be like initiating with somebody else, right? So for instance, that would be 1 in initiating, and then 7 would be circumscribing, separating out from that other person. recap some of the things that we went over for today. We were talking about some of the needs that we fulfill through relationships, development, and the strategies that we use to maintain relationships over time. For next class, we'll look a little bit more about how communication directly plays into relationships. I'll be asking you to read a little bit more from Wrench for that class. So you're welcome to continue on the prompt if you're still working through that, but I'd like you to pass forward what you have for today. Once you've done that, you're free to go, and I hope that you have a great week.